A former Viet Cong guerrilla sat in an interrogation room at Nui Dat in the summer of 1969, hands bound with paracord, his black pajamas still damp from the creek where he had been captured. He had been fighting the Americans for 3 years. He had ambushed Marine patrols outside Da Nang. He had survived B-52 strikes in the Iron Triangle. He had crawled through tunnels so narrow that his shoulders scraped both walls simultaneously. He was not a man who frightened easily. But when the Australian intelligence officer asked him about the small patrols operating in the jungle west of the long high hills, something changed in the prisoner's face. His voice dropped. His eyes moved to the floor. And what he said next would confirm what Allied intelligence had suspected for months but could never quite prove. He said his unit had standing orders, issued directly from regimental command, to avoid contact with the Australians at all costs, not the Americans, not the South Vietnamese. The Australians, he called them by the name every Viet Cong fighter in Phuoc Toi province knew, Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, and then he said something that the Australian officer would carry with him for the rest of his life. He said, "We were not afraid of the American GIS or the Australian infantry or even the B-52 bombing. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear." That single statement, later echoed in captured documents, prisoner interrogation transcripts, and post-war interviews with former Viet Cong commanders, would become one of the most revealing assessments of Allied military effectiveness to emerge from the entire Vietnam War. It was not delivered by a general reviewing maps in an air-conditioned headquarters. It was delivered by a man who had been living in the jungle, fighting for his life, watching his friends vanish without explanation. And it told a story that neither the Pentagon nor the history books were particularly eager to tell. The story of an enemy who respected a force of barely 500 men more than it feared the most powerful military machine ever assembled. To understand what the Viet Cong actually said about the Australian SAS and why those words mattered, you have to understand what was happening on the ground in Phuoc Toi province between 1966 and 1971. You have to understand the war the Australians were fighting, which was fundamentally different from the war the Americans were fighting, even though both were being fought in the same country, against the same enemy, under the same brutal sun. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam in June of 1966, attached to the 1st Australian Task Force headquartered at Nui Dat. The entire SAS contingent in country at any given time numbered no more than roughly 150 men, organized into 3 rotating Sabre squadrons, each taking year-long deployments. They operated in small patrols of 5 or 6 men, inserted by helicopter into jungle so dense that the canopy blocked sunlight at ground level. Their mission was reconnaissance. Their method was silence. Their reputation was something the enemy would build for them, word by terrified word. In 6 years of operations, the Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols across Phuoc Toi province and into the neighboring provinces of Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Thuy. During that entire period, only 1 SAS soldier was killed in action. 1 additional trooper died of wounds. 3 were killed in accidents. 1 went missing. 28 were wounded. Against those losses, the SASR accounted for 492 confirmed enemy killed, 106 probable kills, 47 wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. It was the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any unit from any nation in the entire Vietnam War. The numbers alone were staggering, but it was the words of the enemy that told the deeper story. The first major indication that the Viet Cong viewed Australian forces differently from American forces came not from a prisoner's mouth, but from captured documents. Throughout the war, Allied intelligence teams regularly seized enemy papers during operations, everything from logistical manifests to political directives to tactical guidance for local commanders. Most of this material dealt with the American enemy, which made sense given that the United States was by far the largest military presence in country. But beginning in late 1967 and accelerating through 1968, Australian intelligence officers began noticing something unusual in documents captured within and around Phuoc Tuy. The enemy was issuing separate tactical guidance for dealing with Australian forces, and the tone of that guidance was dramatically different from anything written about the Americans. The documents addressing American forces emphasized predictability and exploitable patterns. American units moved in large formations that could be heard and tracked from considerable distances. American soldiers carried hygiene products whose chemical signatures lingered in the humid air, allowing enemy scouts to detect patrols from hundreds of meters away. American forces relied heavily on helicopter insertions that created noise signatures audible for kilometers. American tactical doctrine favored immediate escalation to heavy supporting fires, primarily artillery and airstrikes, which followed predictable timelines that allowed ambush teams to withdraw through pre-planned routes before the shells arrived. The recommended approach for engaging American forces was aggressive ambush at carefully selected locations, inflicting maximum casualties in the opening seconds, then withdrawing before firepower superiority could be brought to bear. The guidance for Australian forces read like a document written about a completely different kind of enemy. Australian patrols were described as extremely difficult to detect. They could not be smelled because they had eliminated the chemical signatures that betrayed other Western forces. They could not be heard because they moved with a slowness and discipline that created no disturbance in the natural soundscape of the jungle. They could not be tracked because they employed counter-tracking techniques that made visual trail following impossible. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their patience, the documents noted, exceeded anything other Western forces had demonstrated. The recommended approach for dealing with Australian SAS patrols was not ambush. It was avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt to ambush because the Australians were more likely to detect the trap before walking into it. Do not attempt pursuit because Australian counterattack capabilities made the chase potentially suicidal for the pursuers. If contact was unavoidable, break it off as quickly as possible and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not operating. That last instruction is worth pausing on. The Viet Cong, who had fought the French for nearly a decade, who had been battling the Americans and South Vietnamese for years, who operated on home territory with intimate knowledge of every trail, stream, and cave system in the province, were being told by their own commanders to run away from 150 men. The prisoner interrogations reinforced what the documents revealed. Throughout 1968 and 1969, as the Australian Task Force expanded its operations and the SAS pushed deeper into enemy-held territory, the intelligence picture became increasingly clear. Captured Viet Cong fighters consistently described Australian forces in terms that bordered on the supernatural. The term Ma Rung, meaning phantoms or ghosts of the jungle, appeared repeatedly in prisoner statements and captured correspondence. In Vietnamese culture, with its deep spiritual traditions and reverence for the unseen world, calling an enemy a ghost was not casual slang. It carried weight. It suggested something that existed beyond normal human capability, something that could not be fought with conventional weapons or conventional courage, because it did not follow the rules that governed normal combat. One former Viet Cong leader, interviewed after the war, offered an assessment that became perhaps the most widely quoted enemy evaluation of Australian operations. He said the Americans would hit his forces, then call for planes and artillery, and his fighters could usually escape before the heavy ordnance arrived. The Australians, he explained, were different. They patrolled in small groups, moved silently through the jungle, and waited patiently in ambush positions for days. When they struck, it was sudden, devastating, and at close range, and by the time his fighters understood what was happening, it was already over. The implication was unmistakable. The Americans could be predicted. The Australians could not. The Americans could be survived through standard evasion tactics that every guerrilla fighter learned in basic training. The Australians required a fundamentally different response, one that most Viet Cong units in Phuoc Tuy eventually settled on: stay away from them entirely. This assessment aligned with what David Hackworth, one of the most decorated and outspoken American officers of the Vietnam era, observed firsthand. Hackworth spent time with Australian units and later praised their methods extensively. He noted that the Australians used squads to make initial contact with the enemy, then brought in reinforcements to finish the engagement, a methodical approach built on the assumption that a small, well-trained unit could accomplish what larger formations could not. This was the opposite of American doctrine, which sought to overwhelm the enemy through sheer mass and firepower. The Australians believed in precision. The Americans believed in volume. The enemy's own words suggested which approach they found more dangerous. The psychological dimension of what the Viet Cong experienced in Phuoc Tuy went beyond tactical respect. It approached genuine dread, and the reasons for that dread were rooted in the specific methods the Australian SAS employed, methods that seemed to violate the natural order of how jungle warfare was supposed to work. The Viet Cong had spent decades becoming masters of their own terrain. They knew the jungle intimately. They could move through it with minimal noise. They could set ambushes with lethal precision. They could vanish into tunnel networks that went so deep that no amount of bombing could reach them. Against the Americans, these advantages held. American patrols crashed through vegetation, snapped branches, left boot prints in predictable patterns, and broadcast their presence through a dozen detectable signatures before they came within engagement range. The Viet Cong could hear them, smell them, track them, and prepare for them. The jungle belonged to the guerrilla. Against the Australians, these advantages evaporated. Everything the Viet Cong knew about fighting Western armies, every lesson learned through years of bloody experience against the French and then the Americans, became useless against an enemy that refused to behave like a Western army. The SAS patrols moved through the jungle at speeds so slow that they seemed almost geological. Estimates from veterans and after-action reports suggest movement rates of roughly 100 to 200 meters per hour, compared to the 2 to 3 kilometers per day that American reconnaissance units typically covered. At that pace, a patrol covering 5 kilometers could take nearly a week. To American observers accustomed to speed and urgency, this seemed operationally absurd. A pace so slow, it appeared to accomplish nothing. To the Viet Cong, it was terrifying, because it meant the Australians generated no signature at all, no snapping branches, no rustling leaves, no vibrations transmitted through root systems to listening posts, no boot prints in the soft earth, because the Australians had eliminated that signature too, cutting the soles from their standard-issue boots and walking on strips of tire rubber shaped to match the profile of Vietnamese sandals, or wearing captured Ho Chi Minh sandals that left tracks indistinguishable from Viet Cong movement. A tracker who found those prints would assume he was following friendly forces. He would not raise the alarm. He might even walk directly into the Australian patrol, believing he was meeting comrades. No disturbance in the bird calls and insect rhythms that served as the jungle's natural alarm system. When Australian patrols entered an area, the jungle sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. And then, without warning, men would die. The Australian approach to scent discipline deepened the mystery for the Viet Cong. Every American soldier in Vietnam carried standard-issue hygiene products, including soap, deodorant, shaving cream, and insect repellent. These chemicals created scent trails that enemy scouts could detect at remarkable distances. Captured prisoners confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be smelled from 300 to 500 meters away. Even American cigarettes, with their distinctive sweet Virginia tobacco, announced patrol positions to any enemy nose within a substantial radius. The Australians had systematically eliminated every one of these markers. SAS troopers stopped using soap weeks before a patrol. They abandoned deodorant and commercial products entirely. They switched from Western cigarettes to local tobacco, or quit smoking altogether. They ate local food, including fermented fish sauce and rice, which altered their body chemistry at the metabolic level. Some troopers wore the same clothing for weeks without washing, allowing the fabric to absorb the organic scents of the jungle environment. By the time they were inserted into the jungle, they carried no chemical signature distinguishable from the environment itself. They smelled like rot, like mud, like vegetable decay. They smelled like the jungle. Viet Cong scouts, who could smell an American patrol from hundreds of meters away, could walk past a concealed Australian position at arm's length and detect nothing. The Australians had not merely entered the jungle, they had become part of it, as indistinguishable from their surroundings as the root systems beneath their boots or the insects crawling across their motionless hands. Prisoner statements from this period describe incidents that seem almost impossible, but were verified through multiple independent sources. Enemy patrols passed within meters of hidden Australian positions without registering their presence. Viet Cong fighters moved through areas where SAS teams had been lying motionless for hours, sometimes days, and never knew they were being watched. The Australians saw everything. The enemy saw nothing. For guerrilla fighters accustomed to owning the jungle, accustomed to being the ones who watched and waited and struck from concealment, the experience of being hunted by an enemy they could not detect was psychologically devastating. The effect on Viet Cong morale in Phuoc Tuy was measurable and documented. Desertion rates in areas where Australian SAS patrols were active climbed steadily through 1968 and 1969. Political officers reported increasing difficulty maintaining unit cohesion. Soldiers refused night patrol assignments in sectors where the Ma Rung had been reported. Commanders issued orders that went unexecuted because subordinates were too frightened to enter jungle where they believed the phantoms were operating. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, the primary Viet Cong combat formation in Phuoc Tuy Province, experienced this degradation acutely. D445 had been formed on May 19, 1965, recruiting principally from the towns of Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long. It consisted of 3 rifle companies and a weapons company with a total strength of approximately 350 men, though reinforcements from North Vietnamese regulars often swelled its ranks well beyond that number. This was not a collection of poorly armed farmers. D445 was a seasoned provincial mobile battalion with intimate knowledge of the terrain and deep roots in the local population. It had fought the American 173rd Airborne Brigade during Operation Hardihood in May of 1966, when American casualties reached 23 killed and 160 wounded. It had fought the Australians at Long Tan in August of that same year, alongside the 275th Regiment, committing roughly 2,500 fighters against D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, a force of approximately 108 men. At Long Tan, the Australians had held against staggering odds, inflicting devastating casualties through disciplined small arms fire and artillery support that landed with precision as close as 30 meters from their own positions. D445 had survived that engagement bloodied but intact, and it had continued launching attacks on Allied positions, ambushing convoys, and maintaining guerrilla operations across the province through 1967 and the chaos of the 1968 Tet Offensive. But by late 1968 and into 1969, D445's offensive capability had been severely eroded, not primarily through attrition of its fighters, though casualties played a role, but through the systematic destruction of its confidence. The battalion's operational logs from this period, captured after engagements and later analyzed by Australian intelligence, paint a picture of a unit descending into collective anxiety. Entries describe sentries reporting presences in the jungle at night that could not be confirmed by investigation, patrols failing to return from routine movements, fighters disappearing from positions that should have been secure. The logs record requests for reinforcement that were denied because higher command considered the area safe from American operations, not understanding that the threat was not American at all. The long high hills, a limestone mountain range roughly 23 kilometers southeast of Nui Dat, became the epicenter of this psychological confrontation. The Long Hais rose from the coastal plains of Phuoc Tuy like the exposed spine of some buried geological beast, stretching roughly 14 kilometers toward the South China Sea. From the air, the massif appeared deceptively small, a modest ridge of jungle-covered rock that should have been easy to subdue. It was anything but. Beneath the canopy, the mountains contained a labyrinth of underground rivers, limestone caverns, and tunnel complexes that had been expanded and fortified over more than 2 decades of continuous guerrilla occupation. The Viet Cong had not simply dug into these mountains, they had merged with them. They had built underground hospitals, arms caches sufficient to sustain operations for months, political training centers, and command posts so deep within the rock that no conventional weapon could reach them. D445 Battalion and supporting units used the hills as their primary base of operations, and the Long Hais had served as a Viet Cong stronghold throughout the war. American bombing had dropped over 40,000 tons of ordnance on the slopes between 1966 and 1968 without dislodging the defenders. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had conducted multiple operations into the northern approaches. The cave networks ran too deep. The jungle cover was too dense. Helicopter assault was considered suicidal, given the anti-aircraft positions covering every viable approach. Conventional military methods had failed so comprehensively that American ground forces were effectively restricted from operating in the area. The Australian SAS did not try to take the Long Highs through conventional assault. Instead, they did something far more unsettling. They entered the Viet Cong's own backyard, moved through their security perimeters without detection, and simply watched. SAS patrols conducted long-range reconnaissance missions into the Long High Mountains that lasted up to 3 weeks. 5 men operating inside enemy-controlled territory, surrounded by fighters who outnumbered them by factors of 50 or 100 to 1, moving at their agonizing pace, gathering intelligence on every entrance, exit, supply route, and personnel movement they could observe. The information they collected filled thousands of pages of classified reports, but the intelligence gathering was almost secondary to the psychological effect. When the SAS did engage the enemy in the Long Highs, the engagements followed a pattern that the Viet Cong found almost impossible to counter. An SAS patrol would identify a habitual enemy trail, a path worn by the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of movements through the jungle, the path of least resistance between cave complexes or supply points. The Australians would establish an ambush position along this trail and wait, not for hours, for days, motionless, silent, blended into the undergrowth so completely that a man could walk within arm's reach and see nothing but leaves and shadow. When an enemy element moved along the trail, the ambush was over in seconds. Claymore mines initiated the killing zone. Automatic weapons fire raked the engagement area with a volume designed to simulate a much larger force. The Viet Cong, who survived the initial burst, rarely had time to organize a response before the Australians had melted back into the jungle. No extraction helicopter was called. No artillery fire mission was requested. No noise was made that would indicate to enemy reinforcements where the ambush force had gone. The SAS simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the dead and the terror that would ripple through every Viet Cong unit in the area when the bodies were found. The Viet Cong in the Long Highs began experiencing phenomena they could not explain. Sentries reported sounds and movements that left no trace when investigated. Patrol routes that had been used safely for years suddenly became death traps. Fighters sent on routine tasks such as water collection or supply runs failed to return, and search parties found no bodies, no blood, no evidence of what had happened. The enemy began seeing ghosts, in the most literal sense the word allows. They knew something was in the jungle with them. They could not find it. They could not fight it. They could not understand it. And that unknowing was more destructive to their fighting capability than any bomb the Americans had dropped. One particularly revealing set of prisoner statements came from Viet Cong fighters captured during operations in late 1968 and early 1969. Multiple prisoners, interrogated separately and without knowledge of each other's statements, described the same phenomenon. Their units had been ordered to avoid certain areas of Phuoc Tuy entirely, not because of American artillery coverage or air patrol routes, but because of the small Australian teams that operated there. The prisoners used language that intelligence officers noted was unusually emotional for hardened guerrilla fighters. They described the experience of operating in areas where the Ma Rung had been reported as one of constant, unrelenting anxiety. You could not sleep because you did not know if they were watching. You could not eat in peace because you did not know if they had noted your cooking fire. You could not move to a new position because you did not know if they had already mapped your route. The jungle, which had always been the guerrilla's friend, had become something else. It had become the Australians' weapon. This psychological dominance had tangible strategic consequences. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy province, where Australian forces were concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. When they did enter, their behavior changed fundamentally, shifting from offensive aggression to defensive caution. American commanders noticed this disparity and initially suspected the Australians were either in less important areas or were avoiding contact to keep their casualty numbers low. Some even suggested the Australians might be falsifying operational reports to make their sector appear quieter than it was. The captured documents and prisoner statements demolished every alternative explanation. The enemy was explicitly instructing its forces to avoid Australian contact because the Australians were more dangerous. The question that American military analysts wrestled with, and that the Viet Cong's own words made inescapable, was why. What made this small force so much more effective than formations that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude? Part of the answer lay in the Australian military tradition itself. The SASR had not been built in a vacuum. It drew on a century of experience fighting what the British called small wars, colonial campaigns, and counterinsurgency operations where Australian forces had learned to operate on the margins of empire against enemies who could not be overwhelmed through brute force. The Boer War at the turn of the century, the guerrilla campaigns of World War II, where Australian special units like Z Special Unit and the Coast Watchers operated behind Japanese lines in conditions that demanded exactly the kind of patience, fieldcraft, and psychological toughness the SAS would later bring to Vietnam. The Malayan emergency of the 1950s, where Australian forces spent 12 years hunting communist insurgents through primary jungle so dense that visibility rarely exceeded a few meters, and where they developed the foundational patrol techniques that would define SAS operations for decades. The Indonesian confrontation in Borneo in the mid-1960s, where SAS squadrons conducted secret cross-border operations into Indonesian territory and long-range patrols that lasted months at a time, living in the jungle, eating what the jungle provided, learning to track human beings through terrain that seemed to swallow all evidence of passage. It was in Borneo that Australian SAS operators first confronted the reality that would define their Vietnam experience. In the jungle, noise kills, smell kills, and impatience kills faster than any bullet. By the time the first SAS squadron arrived at Nui Dat in 1966, many of its soldiers had already spent years operating in tropical jungle environments. They understood humid air the way a sailor understands ocean currents. They knew how scent traveled through vegetation. They knew how noise propagated through different types of canopy. They knew how to read a jungle floor the way a detective reads a crime scene. This was not theoretical knowledge acquired in a classroom. It was survival knowledge earned through years of operational deployment in environments where mistakes were measured in body bags. The SASR selection process itself filtered for a specific psychological profile that was ideally suited to the kind of warfare Vietnam demanded. Candidates were evaluated not just for physical endurance, though the physical standards were punishing, but for mental attributes that predicted success in extended isolation behind enemy lines. High pain tolerance, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition, and what military psychologists described as predatory patience, the ability to remain motionless and alert for hours, maintaining complete situational awareness while suppressing every human impulse toward restlessness or movement. Only about 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered training that lasted approximately 18 months, 3 times longer than the American Special Forces qualification course of the same era. The Viet Cong's respect for Australian forces was not limited to the SAS. Even Australian regular infantry battalions earned a reputation that distinguished them from their American counterparts. Australian battalions operated in smaller patrol elements than American units typically employed, often at section or half-platoon strength. They moved more slowly through the jungle. They relied more heavily on ambush tactics and less on the massive firepower that defined American operations. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army classified Australian regular infantry units as Viet Cong, commandos, a designation they did not apply to American conventional forces. In the enemy's assessment, even ordinary Australian soldiers fought like special operators. This perception was reinforced by the fact that Australian SAS personnel provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang, where American long-range reconnaissance patrol units received their advanced training, the principles being taught to American special operations soldiers were, in many cases, principles that Australians had been practicing operationally for years. Australian SAS also worked directly alongside American Special Forces and Navy SEALs on joint operations, and in every case the Americans came away with the same assessment the Viet Cong had reached independently. These Australians operated at a level of jungle craft that no other Western force could match. Journalist Gerald Stone, reporting from the field in 1966, described the experience of moving through the jungle with an Australian patrol. He noted that it was a frustrating experience because the Australians moved so carefully and deliberately. Patrols took as long as 9 hours to cover a single mile of terrain. They advanced a few steps at a time, stopped, listened, and then proceeded again. For a journalist accustomed to the pace of American operations, it seemed impossibly slow. For the Viet Cong trying to ambush those patrols, it was impossibly dangerous because a patrol moving that carefully was almost impossible to surprise. The institutional response to what the Viet Cong said about the Australians was, from the American side, complicated by politics and professional pride. General William Westmoreland, commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, reportedly complained to Australian Major General Tim Vincent that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough. This criticism reflected the fundamental philosophical divide between American and Australian approaches to the war. The American way of war in Vietnam was built on the industrial logic of attrition. More bullets, more bombs, more helicopter sorties, more boots on the ground. If a problem could not be solved with firepower, the answer was more firepower. search and destroy operations swept through vast areas of jungle, defoliating vegetation with Agent Orange, cratering the landscape with B-52 strikes, and measuring progress by the number of enemy corpses counted after each engagement. It was war as industrial production, with body counts as the output metric. The Australian way of war rejected nearly every element of this approach. The Australian measure of success was not how many enemy fighters you killed, but how effectively you controlled the population and disrupted the enemy's ability to operate in your area of responsibility. Australian historian Albert Palazzo observed that when the Australians entered Vietnam, they brought their own well-considered concept of war, and it frequently conflicted with American methods. Veteran war correspondent Neil Davis, who spent a decade covering the conflict, later praised Australian troops for being professional and well-trained, noting they fought the people they were sent to fight and tried not to involve civilians, resulting in fewer civilian casualties than American operations typically produced. By the body count metric, a force of a few thousand Australians operating in a single province could never compare to the massive sweep and destroy operations that American divisions conducted across the country. But the Viet Cong's own assessment suggested that the Australian metric, which prioritized control of the population and systematic pressure on enemy logistics and morale over spectacular but often futile applications of firepower, was achieving something the American approach was not. It was making the enemy afraid to fight. The American body count metric held another problem that the Viet Cong's words illuminated. American operations frequently killed large numbers of enemy fighters in individual engagements, but those engagements were often initiated by the enemy on terms favorable to them. The Viet Cong chose when and where to fight the Americans, set ambushes at locations where they held the advantage, and withdrew before American firepower could be fully brought to bear. The body count went up, but so did American casualties, and the enemy always came back. Against the Australians, the dynamic was reversed. The SAS chose when and where to engage. They detected the enemy before being detected. They initiated contact from positions of advantage, and when they struck, the engagement was over in seconds, with catastrophic results for the other side and minimal cost to themselves. The enemy did not come back to areas where this had happened because they were too afraid of it happening again. The post-war period produced additional confirmation of what prisoners and captured documents had revealed during the conflict. Former Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army officers, interviewed by historians and researchers in the decades following reunification, consistently placed Australian forces in a category separate from other Allied troops. A female former member of the Viet Cong stated in an interview for an Australian documentary that her unit was not afraid of the American GIS, the Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing. What they feared, what they hated, was the Australian SAS, because those men made their comrades disappear. The word disappear carried specific meaning. It did not mean killed in a firefight, which was a comprehensible event with identifiable causes and responses. It meant gone, vanished without explanation. A comrade walks into the jungle and never comes back. No gunshot is heard. No blood trail is found. No body is recovered. He simply ceases to exist. For fighters living in constant proximity to death, that particular form of death, the silent and unexplained kind, was the most terrifying of all. This fear had consequences that extended well beyond the tactical level. In areas where Australian SAS patrols were operating, the Viet Cong's ability to control the local population was significantly degraded. The guerrillas' power over Vietnamese villagers depended on the perception of omnipresence, the idea that the Viet Cong were everywhere, knew everything, and could punish collaboration with the government at will. When a force even more invisible than the guerrillas was operating in the same space, that perception collapsed. Villagers in Phuoc Toi began cooperating with Australian civic action programs in ways they never had with American initiatives, not necessarily because the Australians were kinder, though their approach to the population was generally more measured, but because the Australians had demonstrated that the Viet Cong were not the most dangerous presence in the jungle. Someone else was. The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam was not completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops had departed the country. Classified at the highest levels and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, the report reached conclusions that contradicted fundamental assumptions of American military doctrine. It found that small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. The Australian SAS kill ratio stood at approximately 500 enemy for every friendly casualty, compared to a MACV-wide average of roughly 7-to-1 and a conventional infantry average that hovered close to 1-to-1. The disparity was not marginal. It was so vast that it suggested two entirely different wars were being fought simultaneously in the same country. The report also found that indigenous tracking methods provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Proposals were submitted to recruit Native American trackers for similar programs within U.S. forces, but these were never implemented. The assessment confirmed that psychological impact on enemy morale could achieve strategic effects vastly disproportionate to the resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-scale sweep and clear operation involving hundreds of soldiers, artillery batteries, and helicopter gunships. The report also noted, carefully and with evident discomfort, that certain Australian practices would likely violate standing American directives if conducted by U.S. personnel. This observation ensured that the report remained buried in classified archives for decades. The Pentagon had no interest in publicizing the fact that its most effective allies had succeeded partly through methods that American forces were prohibited from employing. Better to let the Australian contribution fade into historical obscurity. But history does not cooperate with institutional convenience. In the decades following Vietnam, fragments of the Australian SAS story emerged through veteran memoirs, declassified documents, and academic research. The methods that were once dismissed as primitive or insufficiently aggressive became standard curriculum at Fort Bragg and Coronado, the training centers for America's own elite special operations forces. The principles of small unit tactics, individual operator judgment, stealth over firepower, patience over aggression, and environmental adaptation over technological reliance were all incorporated into the reformed American Special Operations community that emerged in the 1980s. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, and the entire apparatus of modern American unconventional warfare carry DNA that traces directly back to what a handful of Australians proved possible in the jungles of Phuoc Toi province. But the story of what the Viet Cong said about the Australian SAS cannot be told honestly without acknowledging what it cost to become the kind of soldier the enemy described. The Ma Rung did not emerge from some factory of military efficiency. They were made through a process of transformation that changed men in ways that did not fully reverse when the war ended. Operating at 100 meters per hour for weeks in enemy territory, surrounded by fighters who wanted to kill you, required a psychological adaptation that went far beyond tactical skill. It demanded the suppression of every normal human impulse, the restlessness, the anxiety, the internal noise of planning and worrying and remembering that defines ordinary consciousness. The Australians learned to exist in a state of pure sensory awareness, perceiving without interpreting, observing without planning, responding without deliberating. This state made them invisible in ways that physical concealment alone could never achieve. An enemy scout might look directly at a concealed Australian trooper and register nothing, because the man occupying that position was generating no behavioral signals for the scout's subconscious to detect. But this transformation exacted a toll that no after-action report measured. Veterans of SAS operations in Vietnam reported difficulties readjusting to civilian life that exceeded standard models of post-combat stress. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in the jungle persisted for years and decades after they returned home. The emotional suppression that made them undetectable to enemy scouts made them strangers to their own families. The predatory awareness that allowed them to read a jungle floor like a book made the noise and chaos of ordinary Australian life almost physically painful. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans eventually exceeded those of their American counterparts, despite the Australians serving in smaller numbers and sustaining far fewer casualties. The same qualities that made them the most feared soldiers in Vietnam made them the most damaged when they came home. The Viet Cong called them jungle ghosts. But ghosts are creatures caught between worlds, unable to fully exist in either. Many of the men who became the Ma Rung found that description more accurate than they could have wished. The irony is thick enough to taste. The methods that American commanders dismissed during the war became the foundation of American Special Operations doctrine after it. The lessons were available in 1966. They were not adopted until decades later. The delay, by some estimates, contributed to casualties that better methods might have prevented. The Australians had been willing to teach. The institutions had not been willing to learn. Individual American soldiers and officers who served alongside the Australians recognized the value of their methods immediately. American long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel from the 101st Airborne Division conducted joint operations with SAS squadrons in Phuoc Tuy and came away transformed by the experience. But individual recognition could not overcome institutional inertia. The Pentagon was not interested in lessons that suggested American methods were failing, and the evidence that Australian methods were succeeding was classified and buried precisely because it was so damning to the established doctrine. What the captured Viet Cong fighters said about the Australian SAS remains, more than 50 years later, one of the most honest and revealing assessments of military effectiveness to emerge from the Vietnam War. It was not filtered through political agendas, institutional defensiveness, or the self-serving narratives that tend to dominate official histories. It came from the enemy, from men who had no reason to flatter and every reason to understand exactly what they were facing. And what they said was simple. The Americans were dangerous. The Americans had firepower and technology and numbers that could kill you in 100 different ways. But the Americans could be predicted, could be tracked, could be survived through discipline and patience and knowledge of the terrain. The Australians were something else. The Australians could not be predicted because they followed no pattern. They could not be tracked because they left no trace. They could not be detected because they had become part of the jungle itself. They were not soldiers. In any sense, the Viet Cong understood that word. They were something older, something that belonged to the forest, the way a predator belongs to its hunting ground. And the only rational response to a predator you cannot see, cannot hear, cannot smell, and cannot outrun is the response the Viet Cong chose. Avoidance, fear, respect, Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. 580 men served in the Australian SASR in Vietnam across 6 years of rotations. They conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They lost 6 dead from all causes. They accounted for nearly 600 enemy killed. They generated intelligence that shaped operations conducted by forces many times their size. When 6RAR and the New Zealand Battalion mounted a month-long operation to clear the Maytao Mountains in December of 1969, the operation's success was a direct result of information painstakingly gathered by SAS patrols that had spent weeks moving through the enemy's own strongholds. The SAS had mapped the routes, identified the positions, and provided the targeting data that made the conventional operation possible. Major Reginald Beasley, commanding 3 Squadron during its second tour, kicked down the kills boards that previous squadrons had maintained. His reasoning was simple, and it captured the essence of what made the Australian SAS different from every other unit in Vietnam. "We were not there to kill people," he said, "but to gain information." The killing happened. It was devastating and precise, and it terrified the enemy. But it was never the point. The point was knowledge. The point was control. The point was making the jungle yours. They made the most battle-hardened guerrilla army on earth afraid to enter the jungle. And they did it so quietly that most of the world never heard about it. The Viet Cong heard. The Viet Cong remembered. And when they spoke about it, in interrogation rooms and captured documents and post-war interviews, they said what no official history from any Western nation was prepared to say. They said the Australians were the most dangerous enemy they ever faced. Not the largest, not the most powerful, not the best equipped, the most dangerous, because danger is not about size or firepower or the weight of metal you can throw at a problem. Danger is about what you cannot see coming, and no one in the jungles of Vietnam ever saw the Ma Rung coming. That is what the enemy said. That is what the evidence confirmed. That is the legacy of men who were dismissed as too few, too slow, and too primitive to matter, until the enemy's own words proved that they mattered more than anyone.